from the bio I wrote up, community building and cooperatives. Professionally, I'm a recovering architect, evaluator, and educator. And among my public service roles, presently I serve on the board of the Santa Monica Public Library. I'm a former member of the Sustainability Something or Other at the American Library Association. Presently, I'm also a member of the Resilience Thematic Group of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, aka IUCN. I think I'm paid up member of the Graduate Women in Science, the American Evaluation Association, California Native Plant Society, ad nauseum. I like joining groups. I maintain a transdisciplinary approach to thinking boldly with an empirical basis about how we need to adapt and innovate our cultural systems to both regenerate our ecological systems and the equitable commons. And I have a background in architecture and education, and I'm focusing my work on whole systems thinking based on a mindful approach. So you go to my LinkedIn profile and you can, like, you know, put stars by it or something. So anyway, so let me tell you again, just how we're going to organize this. We're going to go for about an hour and a half. Each and every one of you has been sent a copy of the document that has the same links we're going to be looking at today. And so I invite you to look at them during our conversation on your own computer, or to go back afterwards at your choice, at your discretion. End of each little mini section, maybe a 5 or 10 minute period, then we're going to break for comments and questions and conversation, and then we'll carry on. So we're going to kind of zoom through this in about 45 or 50 minutes. And then at the end, we're going to have little cases. So the idea is that I will give you a little case, the Los Angeles Eco Village, and talk about how it, to some degree, demonstrates some of the ideas we'll be talking about together. And then you are invited to bring up examples that you may want folks to think about together. So those will be our cases, and that will be at the end. All right, so launching into this. When I was like 6, I would climb trees, and I totally connected with trees and nature and birds. And I've always felt an affinity for nature. And then when I was 7, I got my first library card. And so, and the library was based in a cruciform plan. And when I went into the library as a little girl, I twirled around and said to myself, looking at all the books on the shelves, I want to read every book in the library. And so I have, over the course of my life, read across every discipline. So a lot of this, the ideas we're going to be talking about are at the edges of disciplines, at the forward-thinking edges of disciplines, and or at the interstitial areas between disciplines. So a lot of it's interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. And so the challenge that we're looking at is, how can each of us in our households and in our communities, individually and collectively, do the work we need to do to foster resilience and regenerative ways of living? So the reason that we're looking at that scale, which is with the individual person and the individual household, is because that's where we have the most autonomy and sovereignty and power, if you will, to make these changes and then to demonstrate them for ourselves and for others. So there are so many interesting websites out there, and I've curated a set of them for us today, but it is just amazing, the stuff that's popping up. So I invite you to zoom around the internet and try to figure out, if you can, how this stuff kind of fits together. It's very emergent, it's very self-organizing, it's very distributed, but essentially I'm, in my mind, organizing everything around systems. So the paradigm is no longer a machine paradigm, which emerged during the Renaissance, which is linear cause and effect relationships, but in fact it's network relations that are dynamic and evolving. So I look to systems theory and systems thinking. And one of the memes that I like is social and ecological systems, meaning people living in a particular place and the culture of those people, and then the ecology of that place and how those two interact. And so in a sense, it's applied human ecology. So social ecological systems, which you see right here, can you guys see me move my my
Yep.
mouse over that? Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So that's kind of the thread that pulls this together. And so we're looking for a framework of ideas that will help us wrap our heads around this in a whole systems way that brings some kind of coherence to our thinking and to our life ways, and knowing that we're in a transformative period. Okay, so those are the interesting ideas, and then we're going to apply those at the end to some case studies. So I put an oak leaf down here because we have the acorn and we have the tree, and it's ancient, and I thought it was kind of nice there. Okay, so part one, we're going to look at some interesting ideas, and I kind of broke this up into 5 subsections. So design thinking as an approach. So when I first went to architecture school, even though I'd been drawing and fairly creative my entire life, it totally warped my mind because I'd been very text-based, and I had a master's degree in something else, and then all of a sudden I was very visual and very creative and working with a lot of fuzzy thinking and synthesis. So I want to invite all of us to do that today. It's a different way of thinking from the way that we're typically trained in school and in our professions. So we're going to be looking at design thinking as an approach. We're going to look at some of the challenges of this period of time, which by some is called the Anthropocene, meaning that people now have so greatly impacted the earth that we're in a different epoch. Then we're going to talk about some goals to address this challenge. And then we're going to try to figure out what are some of the frameworks, emergent frameworks that have an empirical basis that will help us design programs and projects. And then we're going to say, okay, we're going to get our minds in the right place. We're going to try to maintain a high-minded, connected with nature mindset. And then we're going to figure out how do we do this. So those are the 5 sections within this part 1. So design thinking. So for those of you who've not heard the term, it's a real term, and a lot of people use this term. MIT talks about it. They have design thinking programs. So it refers to this different way of thinking that is very innovative. And so you look across all the different ideas out there, almost like field theory. You look at all the social stuff going on, the cultural stuff, the economic stuff, the environmental stuff. And you just kind of look at what are called wicked problems sometimes. And then part of the key is how do you frame the problem? How do you frame the issue? And as Einstein said, if we think in the same ways that brought us to this point with the problems, then we can't stop us. So we have to reframe the problems in new ways. And this idea of framing comes out of cognitive science. So we have to explore it, we have to slice it and dice it in different ways, and then we focus, okay, this is the way we're looking at it. Now, what do we want the solution to look like? And so essentially it's kind of reframing the situation. I'm going to try to give you, so you can see my hands. And then, what would be the qualities and characteristics of a solution that would resolve those issues in an emergent way that also had all the qualities and characteristics that we like, that it works well with nature, it's resilient and regenerative of nature, that it's equitable in terms of our social bonds and our social contracts with each other, that it's kind to nature and animals and so on and so forth. So that's how we frame the problem, and then we come up with the qualities and characteristics of a solution. And maybe we'll come up with multiple possible solutions. And then we start through an agile and adaptive process moving toward those solutions. And we'll get to that point in a few minutes when we talk about blue marble evaluation. Remember that term, blue marble evaluation. Okay, so we go through different kinds of thinking. We try different things. We're playing around on paper and in our minds. We're imagining. Maybe we'll have a leap, an imaginative leap. And we look for inspiration. We try to have empathy with all the different stakeholders and so forth. And it's both divergent and convergent. So our thinking is both coming together and then we go out. And so it's kind of like being in a helicopter or being with a drone, and you're just flying all over in your mind and visualizing, and maybe having multiple viewpoints at one time. That is what I've learn to do. And we all have that quality, that capability, but that was for me validated when I went to architecture school. So this is what's called design thinking, and it's really fun. And this is where we get a lot of the the best ideas. So you can see here it started in the 50s, but really the methodology goes back, it's ancient. All right, you guys can read that on your own. So we're going to go back to the thing here now. So this is kind of an experiment. I didn't want to do yet another PowerPoint. I wanted to try to figure out how to do this with you guys using this thing. So I hope this works for us. All right, so systems thinking. So we are doing design thinking, and our main framework is that it's a system. It's not a machine. So this is something about what is systems thinking? Well, systems thinking is the interdisciplinary study of systems. So you can just throw out ideas. You can say, okay, what's the relationship between culinary practice and measuring sticks? And you can like just throw these things out at you, and then you figure out, okay, well, it has to do with metrics, and is it linear, and so forth and so on. So basically, you just look at things that you might think on the surface do not relate, but in fact they do. So this is how you can start playing around with interdisciplinary study of systems. So ultimately, the entire system has its own internal logic. It's cohesive, it's whole, it's interrelated, it's interdependent. And of course, nature, under this paradigm, is a system. But as the map is not the territory, similarly, nature is not truly a system. It's just a thinking tool that we use to try to wrap our heads around it. So we always need to maintain that careful rethinking thing, because we can't impose a system if it doesn't work, because it's not the reality, it's just the map that we have of the reality. So general systems theory is about developing broadly applicable concepts and principles. And so it's very abstract and very high level. And now systems as invaded, imbued, infiltrated everything else, all the other disciplines. So architects talk about systems, artists talk about systems, even religious people talk about systems. What are some of the cross-cultural relationships between various religious systems, for example, and how, on and on. So here are some key concepts. You can read this in detail later if you'd like. Things to remember: that systems have boundaries, and that they seek their own equilibrium, and that they are adaptive. They will make internal changes to adapt to their situation or their environment, but they have limits. And if they are pushed too far, they will collapse. And so for a system to have resilience, it's able to withstand a lot of pressure on it, and it can bounce back or bounce forward. Now this guy, Edward T. Odom, this guy is really interesting. I ran into him back in the 1980s, his work. He and his sons and other members of his team down in Florida, they were some of the early systems researchers, and they studied the Everglades. They studied the material and energy exchanges within the Everglades, and they laid the foundation, if you will, for ecological and system science, the empirical basis. So this is really interesting work. Okay, so this is on systems. You can read more about this at your leisure. I'm not much into engineering, because engineers tend by their training and their thinking to be overly reductive. But that's just my point of critique on that. Okay, so now we're going to look at some systems thinking resources. And Donella Meadows. Who here, I'm hoping, has heard of Donella Meadows? Raise your hands. Yay, okay.
Everybody.
Yeah, so she's one of my heroines. This is the Donella Meadows project. She was one of the lead researchers on the first Club of Rome report, which I think was something like 1972. And she's kind of a goddess within this domain. Anyway, she has laid out principles that people still use and find useful. And you'll probably enjoy going through this website. A lot of really cool ideas: biomimicry, mimicking nature, double loop learning, and so on. And this keeps developing. So this is not a static area. This is a very dynamic, emergent, transforming area. So every time I come back here, they've got like new stuff up here. Okay, so one of the interesting ideas that Donella Meadows came up with, and this was toward the end of her career, she wrote a book called something like Primer on Systems, the notion of leverage points. And what she said was, you know, we can do a lot of different kinds of things. We can do this, we can do that, we can do the other, but some things we do give us more leverage and more value for the efforts that we make. So paradigm shift is the most powerful approach, the most powerful idea. I just had a phone call coming in, excuse me. So we can shift if we use a new, if we use systems thinking, and we focus on our goals and how to get to our goals in an adaptive way, we're going to get more impact, more benefit, so long as we remain agile and adaptive. So if we just change the metrics, or we just change, you know, how we add resources, or we just, you know, advance the schedule, say we're going to do something in a month instead of 3 months, that doesn't really help us much. We have to go up here and change everything. So we're thinking in systems, and we're focusing on goals, both qualitative and quantitative. Okay, so that is the design thinking section. We're going to take a quick break for questions, comments, conversation. What do you guys think? Dick, Shelley, Alberto, Art, Charles, Edward, Jack, Quinn, what do you think?
I think we need some specific examples to get our teeth into specific issues and questions.
Well, I have a question or comment or a question for you. How does chaos theory fit into the systems thinking that you're espousing?
Good
Or does
question. Of course it does. It does. You know, I'm not a physicist, but I have a bunch of books on chaos theory here. And one person that I like is that guy out of UC Santa Cruz, the mathematician, whose name will come to me in a moment. But essentially, I think it's when a system is destabilized. That's my memory of how that works. Ralph Abramson. You can read Ralph Abramson on that. He's a mathematician. But remember, I talked about how a system has its boundaries, and it has a homeostatic quality as long as it's stable, it's functioning, it's evolving, but if it becomes too stressed, and if it exceeds its resilient capacity, and I may not be using the words in a precise scientific manner, but then it goes into collapse, and then there is chaos. That would be one scenario. There may be others as well. Does that help?
Arlene?
Yes.
This is Dick. Can a nation be a system?
Yeah.
I'm just trying to get this down to understand.
Yeah, a nation can be a system. Yeah, under this scenario. Yeah, it's like a political body, an economic body. Yeah, it's a system.
And an economic system is capitalism is a system?
Yeah, by this way of thinking, I would think yes.
Okay.
And then there are different ideas about how that system should be governed. And, you know, I would for example, look to the work of Eleanor Ostrom on
Yeah.
her distributed governance systems.
Life and death disputes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Arlene, I've got a comment. May I make a comment here?
Yeah.
When Mike brought in chaos theory, and then when a system collapsed, I'm in the middle of a book by Ugo Bardi called
Uh-huh.
Before Collapse.
Okay.
And I've already read Tainter's Collapse of Complex Systems or Civilizations, and
How do you
I've
spell
read
Hugo Barty? How do you spell Hugo Barty?
Ugo is UGO and his last name is Bardi. Before Collapse. It has another secondary title I can't think of.
Okay.
But I wanted to say something about each of the collapse scenarios, just a tiny bit.
Yeah.
The Tainter one says the more complex, the more ready for collapse. Dmitry Orlov said, that's the book, there you go. Dmitry Orlov says there are 5 stages of collapse. First, it's economic, then political, then commercial, then social, then civilizational. And
Mhm.
Barty's already taking it. I'm probably 2/3 of the way through. He's already taking it to the apocalyptic collapse that many of us are concerned about relative to climate change. That's all I needed to say, just to relate all of those books to this.
Okay. Yeah, let me give you Ralph Abrams too.
Seems to me a good example of a system would be the United States, and a good example of a leverage point would be this coming Tuesday. Voting.
Exactly.
Oh,
Yeah.
The voting process
Metal Meadows and her leverage points. Yeah.
mechanism for the whole country could change everything
Mm-hmm.
big ways with all in one day.
Yeah, so this guy, Ralph Abraham, is really far out and pretty interesting. So that would be another possible resource if you wanted to follow up on that point. Okay, any further comments or questions before we zoom ahead here?
yeah, I had a question
Sure.
in relation to chaos theory and systems, and I was thinking systems of systems, because we have all these systems within an overriding environmental system, right? So I'm wondering about chaos would give a chance for like a system that has unproductive for the entire system to realign itself with an overriding system. People have been writing about that.
Well, but the idea that I understand is that essentially systems need to be emergent. They need to, it's a bottom-up process if it's actually, has an empirical basis. A top-down is really an imposition, and it can become oppressive, and it can actually create additional problems.
No, I'm
So-
thinking more in terms of environmental system, and our particular capitalist system has its own certain coherence, but it's not going to work. I mean, ultimately, it has been working as a system, but it is incoherent with the overriding environmental system. So I'm thinking, does it have to like go through a certain chaos period in order to realign itself with?
I don't know. I
Okay.
imagine there would be multiple possibilities or scenarios, but in general, the way I've heard it described is that economics is essentially about power relations,
Mhm.
and then money is the instrument of aggregating or imposing power,
Mhm.
and it's extracting from nature, and it's using nature as a free resource and also as a sink. And therefore it's not integrated and it's not sustainable.
Right.
Yeah, so there's this whole thing about donut economics. There are many ideas on this. This idea of donut economics, you guys have heard of this, right? This one?
No.
Yeah,
No.
donut economics, but that's just one. Ecological economics is another one.
Mhm.
There's a lot of people out there trying to wrap their heads around this. But essentially it's about how do we map, how do we create a diagram, a network diagram, a systems diagram of all the different pieces, material energy exchanges in our social and ecological systems. So if you go social and I love just playing around on this stuff. And then we're going to put in economics, right? Sustainable economics. You guys can just zoom around the internet and you'll get like amazing stuff. Here's a bunch of diagrams. It just goes on and on. Go ahead. Questions?
That's good.
Okay, any more on this before we go to the next section? How about this one? This looks like a good one.
What?
See this article, linking economic growth pathways and environmental sustainability? Okay, nobody's saying anything. Do you want me to go back to the presentation? All right, so we're moving on from our section on how to think in a fuzzy way and outside of the box, thinking about systems and focusing on what would the solutions look like. Now, in the past, you know, policy, a lot of our organizational policies and programs are based on short-term thinking, 1-year plans, 5-year plans, and then we develop a program and an evaluation system around that program or that project, and it's funded in the short term. And people's careers and so forth are based on these short-term incremental programs and projects. Well, it turns out that that doesn't work in this kind of situation. So there's a new approach or a different approach called decision making under deep uncertainty. This section right here, decision making under deep uncertainty. And there's a link here for an entire book on this. And I went to a conference about 2 years ago by an organization called Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty, and they're getting ready to host the next one in the next couple of weeks, so you guys can sign up for it if you like. The one that I attended was co-sponsored by RAND and the University of the Netherlands at Delft. And this was a room of about 60 total brainiacs. It was so cool, and was held in Culver City, which was geographically close to me, so I just drove over there, and it was like totally cool. So I love this stuff, but notice that what they're saying is this entire area, can you see how I'm showing my cursor? You guys can see that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so if it's a deep issue, and if there are, you know, a few policy options, then it works well with decision making under deep uncertainty. But if there are many options and there's a lot of uncertainty and the system is not well characterized, then it becomes a situation where this other methodology, this adaptive methodology, decision making under deep uncertainty, is appropriate and will hypothetically lead us toward better outcomes, more sustainable, resilient outcomes. So once again, our mindset or our frame is social ecological systems, and I kind of abbreviate it like SOS. This is a period of SOS in the SES. And here's one of many articles that can kind of give you an overview of this notion of social and ecological systems, human ecology, applied human ecology, people living in place. And again, our scope, our scale is the individual household, the individual, and maybe even the neighborhood or the community. So it's the biogeophysical unit and all its associated social actors and institutions. This is sort of Eleanor Ostrom type talk, social actors and institutions. And you can see there's issues of nonlinearity, emergence, scale, self-organization, pretty much totally bottom up. So, and nature does have its own internal coherence, and it wants to self-organize. And so we need to enable that through our interaction with nature. Okay, so this right here is a link to this entire book, which is mind-blowing, and this is a screenshot from page 11. And you can see here that it says, decision-making in the context of deep uncertainty requires a paradigm that's not based on predictions of the future, known as predict then act, which is that short-term 1-year, 5-year thinking, but that aims to prepare us to adapt to uncertainty, because we don't know exactly how this stuff is going to emerge and how it's going to play out. So it needs to be agile, needs to be adaptive. So we monitor and adapt on a go forward basis. So it's very dynamic and very agile. So we need to remain agile. Okay, so that's the end of section B here, which is challenges of the Anthropocene, SOS, the SES. Any questions, comments, conversation? Talk to me.
It just
Okay.
occurred to me about the agility necessary right now with the election that's coming up.
Mhm.
And just to, no more comment than that, but
I would say in situations of great uncertainty, you look for what the great dangers are and you focus on those. Also, you proceed with small steps to probe and see what works and what doesn't because you don't know what's out there. Seems like general strategies for this scenario of not well characterized situations and highly uncertain situations.
But is it totally defensive, or do you not also need to have a positive vision?
Well, I think it needs to be pretty much defensive and not make any big mistakes.
Okay, so
Global
incremental
warming
and
might be a good
cautious.
example. In other
Anyone
words, don't put too much carbon in the atmosphere. That could be a very big mistake.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Well, there are engineering firms out there that want to make a ton of money by figuring out how to take it out.
Yeah, well, that could be a big mistake too if you take it out in the wrong ways, like
Thank
by
you.
putting something else out into the atmosphere in order
Yeah.
to remove carbon from the atmosphere.
Okay, yeah, yeah, that's the design thinking, exactly, maintaining a critical attitude and looking at the entire system. And this is one of the points of critique of engineered solutions is, and in opposition to what are called nature-based solutions, is that they tend to think of one thing, one linear mechanistic intervention rather than looking at the entire system. So that's why we're systems thinkers as opposed, and we're using design thinking as opposed to engineering thinking. Okay, moving along here. So the next thing is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I did have a question about this book. Does he discuss a decision making in which you eliminate uncertainty by choosing a leader, an authoritarian leader, a fascist? That would be one solution to an uncertain social situation.
You are quite the provocateur, and you know the answer is no.
Okay.
What about Plato's philosopher king? If you can find just the right person, let that person be a dictator. They have to have a good heart and really want to fix the society or help the society. I mean,
Well,
he
Plato
needs some pretty perfect characteristics here. But given all that, if you can find the right person, the philosopher king would probably be the best way to run the world.
maybe that would be, that's one hypothetical, but the pushback on that would include something like the following. It turns out that Theseus, I think it was called, where who was the guy that drunk the hemlock? Was that
No, Socrates.
It turns out that there was a lot of controversy at that time. I have some books here on that. But among other things, that Plato thought that, and I would love it if somebody can help me track down the reference on this, but I understand that Plato thought that ideas had their own natural order that was vibratory and organized themselves into crystalline forms. So then the perfect Platonic leader, and presumably that would be a male under that way of thinking, would have perfect knowledge and understanding. And I don't think that's possible. And in fact, then people use that as a pretext to impose, as I think Dick might agree, to impose an authoritarian. I mean, is that kind of aligned with what you're thinking, Art?
Oh, yeah, I'd agree with that. That's probably an impossible thing to find that person because until they've ruled, you can't tell whether they're that kind of person or not, and they don't know it either.
Right.
I mean, you can't just appoint somebody in the abstract and say that seems to be a perfect person. Let's appoint them to be the philosopher king, because they can't possibly really be the philosopher king without experience. And so they have to be the philosopher king for a while in order to be the philosopher king. And in other words, you don't know until you try the guy out.
Well, interestingly, Shelley has a question, but I want to respond to your point, if I may, before Shelley speaks up. Art, I love reading cross-cultural anthropology, and in some cultures, the grandmothers appoint the leaders, and if the leader makes a mistake, then the grandmothers remove him. And part of the rationale is that the grandmothers know these people from the time they were toddlers, and they know the character.
I like that.
Maybe we need the grandmothers to select the leaders and have the ability to remove them if they don't behave properly. Anyway, Shelley, what do you want to say?
Well, actually, Gladys had called and had a question, but she's going to find another way of answering it. And I missed some of what you were saying, but what occurred to me, I mean, is it possible with any kind of authoritarian leader for the system to be egalitarian? I mean, is there a system where that has actually happened? You're talking about a matriarchal system or something, you know, with the grandmothers in charge, and that's not really with one person being in charge. That's with the matriarchal systems. I mean, didn't they have maybe one person was overseeing the health of the community, but it wasn't like an authoritarian kind of position, right?
Yeah, anthropologists have documented a lot of this, and Eleanor Ostrom had a lot of her work looked at this too. So I think that's right, Shelley. And I'm not an expert. I am just a curator of ideas, and I just love these ideas.
I just want to, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Because I've been thinking about the scale of things. I mean, at first I was thinking, well, there have been organizations into uncertainty when we look at the past of like cathedrals being built that took several generations, and whoever decided to come up with the cathedral or castle or whatever it was, you know, didn't live to see the end of it because it took that long to build oftentimes. But those things continue to be made, bridges and even the saving of slaked lime and stuff like that went on for generations. But I'm thinking that it has to do with the population, actually, that it comes down to, in the past, there were so few people that you could have a community where something would continue on, that things didn't move as quickly. And again, when you mentioned the grandmothers, who alive would be able to be on a panel that they knew all contenders from the time that they were toddlers? That only exists in a tiny tribal situation that in reality cannot really be in this period of time with the populations that we have.
Well, we're looking to examples of circumstances that hypothetically, that based on empirical research on what's worked in the past, hypothetically could work in the future. And again, our scale is the community at best, where the scale of this conversation is local. But yeah, you raise a lot of good points. I'm going to circle back to what you said about cathedrals. I happen to know a little bit about that. On cathedrals, typically they were built on the sites of ancient pagan ritual sites, where in Western Europe, can you hear me okay?
Somebody needs to turn off their mic.
Turn off their mute your thing here. We're getting feedback, please. Okay, so cathedrals like Chartres, like Notre Dame, and so on, Canterbury, they tended to be built on ancient pagan sites where there had been oak groves. A lot of these were Druidic sites. They were north of Rome, out of Rome. So essentially, it was the imposition of a military and or overlord system on the former Druidic system, and they used the cathedral to actually solidify their power. And it took a lot of money to build a cathedral. You had to have the money to get those resources and so on, but you'll notice that the ceilings, for example, all of that, those arches, they're actually reminiscent of an oak grove. So Yeah, I find cathedrals really interesting for a lot of reasons, but also politically and economically, and how they shifted the underlying metaphysics of the culture at that time. Anyway, may we go on because we're running a little short here, and I want to make sure we get through this. Anything more, Quinn? Is that okay? Okay, all right, so moving on, empirically based frameworks. So we're trying to figure out what framework can we use. We do need fuzzy thinking, but at some point we need to be able to put it down on paper and model it and use some algorithms and artificial intelligence and so on, and people are doing that. But essentially the goal here, because remember we're trying to figure out under design decision making under deep uncertainty, figure out what are the qualities and characteristics of our goal. And we know that we want we want a bottom up emergent culture that is regenerative, conserving and regenerative of nature, and also of authentic community. So there's a lot of work out there on that. Just to give you a couple of pieces, links here. I'm calling it wise ways and new traditions. Wise ways meaning that we look to traditional ways, and then we have to develop new traditions. So this is something on regenerative design. It's a process-oriented whole systems approach to design, where we want the system not to be degraded, but rather to regenerate nature. I'll give you an example. And one of the reasons I call myself a recovering architect is because under architecture, as has been practiced since the Renaissance, you find a site, you scrape the site, you kill everything on the site, and then you put down a building as an object, and then you plant, either put down a hardscape and pavement and so on, and or you put down some decorative plants. Well, that is not regenerative. That is actually destroying life. And that's part of the problem with our cities. So we need regenerative design that looks at what life wants to live there. What was the historic ecology of the area? And how can we support the reemergence of that historic ecology, being mindful that things will shift under climate change, but then looking at regenerating the historic ecology, then how can we create habitat for human beings? You know, minimal buildings, carbon neutral, also agroecology so that we can grow our own food locally, so on and so forth. So that would be conceptually a way of thinking about regenerative design. And of course, it's participatory, it's agile, there are lots of feedback loops, and it's very participatory. Sometimes it's called green design, sustainable design. A lot of the words kind of mean the same thing under fuzzy thinking. And the idea is that we want to co-evolve humans and nature. And we want to think in the context of the place. It's very place specific. What is the historic ecology of that place? And not only that, but what indigenous people live there and how did they live in that place? So for example, where I live here, we had what are called the Tongva, and they were here for over 10,000 years. They had about 200 villages in the area. And by some accounts, some of them were here for 200,000 years. Well, they lived here sustainably. We can learn a lot from them. So that's what I mean here in this case by wise ways. Permaculture is kind of a vernacular form of agroecology, if you will. Another term is regenerative organic agriculture. A lot of people are trying to figure out how to wrap their heads around this and what label to put on it. So there's a lot of stuff out there on this, and I invite you to get your mind into it. There's even a Facebook page on regenerative cultures. Let me see here. It's coming up. It's coming up. I'm probably running out of bandwidth. I'm in a multifamily area, and on the weekends, that's like the internet gets slow. Okay, this is like one interesting page at Facebook, Regenerative Cultures. And there's just a lot of stuff here. Ecosystem restoration at the dawn of the center of regeneration. You can see 89,000 people like this page. Regenerative whole systems design, education and consulting, blah, blah, etc. So there's a lot out there for those of you who want to continue to delve into this. And then I don't remember why I brought this one up, but let's try it. Oh, this may be, hang on. Oh yeah, and here's a page of this guy, Daniel Christian Wall. I think somebody, Jack or somebody was mentioning this.
Jeff
Yeah.
Olsner mentioned Daniel Wall and his work.
Yeah, so here's his page, or correction, this is the press that's publishing his work. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff out there. But remember, in a certain sense, it's really simple. It's about agile, adaptive systems, and we're making decisions under deep uncertainty, and we're using fuzzy thinking and design thinking, and we're maintaining a high consciousness, because this is really challenging and we have to think in new ways. Okay, so that is, I believe, the end of that section. Questions, comments?
What do you mean by fuzzy thinking?
Okay, back at the beginning, Art, up here under design thinking. Fuzzy thinking is the ability to kind of, let me see. Fuzzy thinking is you kind of, it's sort of like looking in your icebox and seeing a bunch of stuff and trying to figure out what to make for dinner. You kind of look at it and you think, okay, I could put those three things together. I'd have to cook the other thing first. Oops, I need to pull this other thing out of the cupboard. That's fuzzy thinking.
In other words, thinking more of the whole and less in terms of specifics, I think you're saying.
Yeah, and it's sort
look
of
at
like
the
living,
whole situation as holistically as possible.
yeah, and it's like in my mind, I kind of, if I need to do fuzzy thinking, I go lay down and meditate and I take a little nap. And that's how I do my fuzzy thinking. That's what Einstein did. He went and took a nap. And the guy that discovered DNA, remember Crick and the double helix? The double helix came to him in a nap. That would be an example of fuzzy thinking. So it's probably, the condition called fuzzy thinking is probably the most disturbing symptom. Oh, of perimenopause. Never mind, I pulled up the wrong example here. But fuzzy, it's just a different way of thinking that's very kind of creative and free. Does that help, Art?
Well, I think it means general.
It could
Thinking.
mean general, but it could mean other things as well.
It's the
Yeah.
kind of thinking that brings a specific solution out of a big general situation.
Kind of, yeah, that would be, okay, that's one way. Now, I tried to map this thing out because I wanted to make sure we have enough time. So there's a lot in this section. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. So gather your thoughts, and then we're going to go from planning and design all the way down to the earth. So notice at this scale, we're scaling up. So we're starting with the individual, and then we're going to the community, and then the bioregion, and then the earth. So we're going to go through this in about 10 minutes. So presumably most folks on this call have heard of deep ecology, and that's just kind of honoring the earth as a living entity. And there's a lot of evidence. It's called among other things, it's called the Gaia hypothesis, that the earth is alive and that it promotes the inherent worth of all living things regardless of their instrumental utility to human needs. Now, I was on something the other day with some physicists who said that there's now evidence that okay, wait a minute. The reason that paranormal research doesn't always result in the same outcomes, the same data, is because in fact, quarks have their own consciousness, something like that. So this is kind of like the edge of science right now, but the basic idea is that nature has its own consciousness and that it has its own inherent value, and therefore we our ethics are not properly aligned when we don't value the natural world and its complex of relationships on which all organisms depend. So that's the concept of deep ecology. And this is kind of a neat article. You can look at Eurocentric bias. You can look at, how we need to consider non-human interests. Scientism. I just was looking at a book by a guy named James Tunney. He calls this the dark age of scientism. And James Tenney's a really fascinating guy. He is a barrister, an Irish barrister, who basically decided didn't want to be an international attorney anymore, and so he wrote a book on light, magical light and spiritual darkness. And he basically, anyway, he's kind of a really interesting scholar dude. Okay, back here, I digress. Social ecological systems. So the Stockholm Resilience Center is a really interesting center at the University of Stockholm that did have Johan Rockström. Johan Rockström is no longer there, but it was they who conceived of the notion of the 9 planetary boundaries. It's now kind of been discredited. It's really useful as a thinking tool, but it turns out that these boundaries gave some folks too much confidence that they could go up to these edges. So now, as I understand it, folks are looking more to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. But the Stockholm Resilience Center is a really neat organization. They've got a lot of great graphics. They have a lot of research on how to take this information and apply it in an urban environment, in a landscape environment, how to steward nature. Wonderful, wonderful resources there. So I invite you to take a look at that. Nature-based solutions is now the policy of the IUCN, and some of the countries in Europe have now adopted this. So the idea is not engineered solutions, but rather nature-based solutions, and it's abbreviated NBS. So there's a huge amount of information here, and it all has an empirical basis. And then they apply it around the world in different cases, and then continue to study it. So there's a natural resources governance framework. The European Union has adopted this, and I invite you to just go through this site. It's really interesting, in my view. There's a Wikipedia page on that, kind of summarizes it. Okay, now there are a whole bunch of accords and protocols on how to do this. And it's more than we can go through now, but essentially they're taking the best science and they're working with scientists and practitioners to try to figure out kind of what are the guidelines that will help us maintain an agile approach and adapt. So here's nature-based solutions as a force for managing our natural resources. Now, here's the Blue Marble evaluation, and this is approach, methods, criteria, and standards. And notice that standards is in quotation mark because the standards are emergent and evolving. So this was developed by a guy named Michael Quinn Patton, who's the former president of the American Evaluation Association. He's a force to be reckoned with. He lives in a cabin north of Minneapolis in the woods, and he's a former academic. He was on the faculty and headed a department at the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis for quite some time. And he said, you know, this is not working. And he kind of came to the same place that some of these other folks that we've already covered came to. We need to figure out how to manage ourselves during these times where we need to make decisions and plan programs and projects under deep uncertainty. We need principles that will help guide us, and we need to be agile and adaptive. So he developed this evaluation methodology to help people who are designing programs and projects to figure out how to do that and avoid that 1 year, 2 year, 5 year problem. And it's quite robust and quite well received. He's one of the leading thinkers in the American Evaluation Association, and he was a featured speaker at the AEA conference, which just ended last week. So if anybody's looking for a methodology, I invite you to take a look at this one. The other one would be Visionary Evaluation by Beverly Parsons, but Beverly and Michael Quinn are both friends, and they work together. So I offer this to you as probably the most available and interesting thing you can find. Okay, here we have the SDGs from the UN. This is kind of supplanted the 9 planetary boundaries from the Stockholm Resilience Center. And it has its limitations as well. I've heard quite a lot of critiques of it, but for the moment, it seems to be kind of the way that people can begin to work together around the globe to address these issues. But we all need to be mindful that this is, again, emergent and it will change. But for the moment, this is one of the leading tools. Okay, so we're back on Donella Meadows, and apparently I put this in here twice. Please excuse me. Now, let's talk about this notion of paradigm shift. For those who may not have heard of it, it came from this guy, Thomas Kuhn, who wrote this book, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which I think was published back in like 58 or 62, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
And he was a philosopher of science, and he looked at science over several hundred years and how it changed. And what he found was that science makes little shifts, but as new information, new data becomes available, the prevailing theories, and that at a higher level, the prevailing paradigm must shift because it no longer works. So this is how we get from the notion of the machine age to the systems age. So the Renaissance, by this way of thinking, was essentially operating under the paradigm of the machine. Similarly, architecture under modernism, for example, was operating under the paradigm of the machine. As Corbusier said, the building is a machine for living. We are now in a systems paradigm, but remember that the map is not the territory and the system is not the actual reality. It's just a way of thinking. So that comes from Thomas Kuhn, just so you have that intellectual touch point there. And you can read more about it. Here's a really cool article in The Guardian. Okay, so now that's kind of an overview of how to plan and design or frame our thinking so we can develop programs and projects. And then we need to work at different scales. We need to work at the home scale and the community scale. And then we're going to zoom up to the bioregion. And bioregions typically are a watershed. So when we're talking about a bioregion, we're talking about a watershed, typically, but not always. Okay, so Ostroms, who here has heard of Eleanor Ostrom? Maybe raise your hand. Who's heard of Eleanor Ostrom? Oh gosh, okay. Eleanor Ostrom got the Nobel Prize. She's the first woman to get the Nobel Prize for economics. And she studied traditional cultures around the world. And she then synthesized that and came up with the basis for the commons and the new commons movement. And actually, it's not the tragedy of the commons. It's now been reframed as the tragedy of the markets. The commons, actually, traditional societies actually manage their resources quite well. And it's actually under markets that we have gotten to this point of a tragedy. So Garrett, this debunks Garrett Hardin's essay on the tragedy of the commons. It's actually the tragedy of the markets. There's another guy, David Bollier, and he talks about the tragedy of the markets. Okay, so on the commons, there's an International Association for the Study of the Commons, IASC. Oh gosh, sorry about that. Well, the IASC is the International Association for the Study of the Commons. And a lot of this is based on, it's founded on the work of the Ostroms, and then it's gone forward. So this is another incredible resource for you. And there are regional chapters. Maybe you've got one somewhere near you in Arkansas. Let's see here, North America. Oh, this guy Marco, he's down at the University of Arizona. Okay, so you got to take a look at that in your spare time. Okay, so here's more about On the Commons. Here's the Center for New Economics, which comes from the work of Schumacher. Remember, Small is Beautiful? Well,
Yep.
that's now morphed into the Schumacher Center, which is amazing. And they have great programs. They have events which are recorded, and you can go back and look at them. They had one about a week ago on land. This guy, Michael...
Isn't that Monbiot? Is that
Yeah,
George Monbiot? This is today. This one was today, the 20, what's today? No, it's not. It was last week. Sorry. Yeah, I got real excited when I got to the Schumacher Center. We have that book and read it thousands of years ago. Small is Beautiful.
There's a new book. There's a new book. And somewhere I've got a link to it. but this is really great stuff. And the neat thing about this also is that it includes some really fabulous thinkers. If I can figure out how to make this show up here, let me see. I can't get to it now because we've got all this stuff going on my screen here. Wait a minute. Okay, let's try this. Second. I want to show you the people who are associated with this because there's some really amazing people. So David Bollier is their program director, and he's fabulous. And there's a lot of his presentations on YouTube and also here. And this guy, Greg Watson's pretty cool also. Anyway, I invite you to take a look at that as what I find to be an amazing resource. So that's the Center for New Economics. And then here, one of my heroes, David Bollier, and this is his website. And he's so incredibly well read, and he speaks like a Methodist minister. So he can say the most amazing stuff, and he says it, and it just comes across as so beautifully reasonable. So he's got some great books here. Sorry about this. He's got some great books here. Okay. So that's at the community scale. There's others. There's one, I can't remember right now, but there's quite a number of these. If anyone's interested, let Lolly know, and Lolly and I'll put together additional resources for you. Here we go. Institute for Self-Reliance. Remember, generally bioregions are organized around watersheds. Here's the Schumacher Center. Here's the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Lots of resources here. Again, taking back the power of the community, and one of the concepts that I've seen here and at others is community wealth building. So the idea is to push back against Wall Street and to build Main Street so that they're not extracting wealth from the community, but rather the benefits and profits are aggregating to the community. Community broadband, fiber optic is one of the local cool ideas of the moment as well. Okay, and then the Sustainable Economies Law Center. This was new to me about 2 months ago, and this woman, Janelle Orsi, is said to be like totally dynamite. Anyway, she's in Oakland, and she's an attorney, and I have a 600-page book here written by her on practicing law in the sharing economy, which is actually published by the American Bar Association. So she looked at law, and she put together this book suitable for attorneys on how to build co-ops and community land trusts and so on, based on what the law says now. They're also training attorneys, and they're working on resilient communities, food and farming, cooperative, worker self-directed nonprofits, so on and so forth, housing, community land trusts, limited equity housing co-ops, and they're also training a whole cohort of young attorneys. So this is a really amazing resource with good people. Okay, so that's kind of the bioregion, and then we're going to scale up to the Earth. So many websites. This is one called Future Earth, which is kind of fun. They've got some grandiose ideas there, and they've got this cute little EAR thing happening there, nice graphic. It's a global network of scientists, research, and innovators collaborating, because remember, this is adaptive. We're figuring it out as we go. Therefore, it's principles-based, agile, and adaptive, because we're making these decisions under deep uncertainty. And as Art would say, we need to minimize risk. Partner Transformations Network, another example. There are many others. Many pressing challenges. They've got working groups, and I'm a member of quite a number of these things, and they just keep growing and morphing. And when you get like the 20-year-olds, we've got Google groups, we've got Slack. It's like amazing how these kids are just jumping in and running with this stuff. I can't keep up. And then here we have the IUCN again. And again, they have their broad networks of scientists and experts. And I, for example, am a member of this one, something for ecosystem management. And so it's really cool to get into these networks, and I get a lot of very interesting information from being a member of this group. Commission on Ecosystem Management, I think, is the actual name of that. So we've now reached the end of this very long section, planning and design, how to figure out how to get a handle on this so that we can adapt and manage in an agile manner on a go-forward basis under deep uncertainty. Time for questions and comments. What do you think?
It's all a little overwhelming. I mean, there is so much going on here. I am such at, I mean, so much of it is over my head and new to me. But I'm immediately thinking, how do we start to implement this? And it goes from the individual being able to think fuzzily, think adaptively and creatively. So you have to do all this inner work, and then you're taking it to this social level. I mean, the Transitions US calls it sociocracy, a way of governance with consent, kind of like on consensus with no overriding governance. And then you're taking it to these people who have developed systems of a process of looking at the entire bioregion or the entire Earth, looking at this globally. So I'm just wondering, like, when you start to move into this, how do we actually? I mean, how do these groups operate? What do they actually do?
Well, okay, I'm going to try to answer your question. Different people have different ideas on this. My idea, partly because I'm older, you know, and I get in meetings or calls with, like, you know, Zoom calls with like 80 people, and about 80% of them are 22. At this point, I think we need to focus locally. So I'm trying to do this stuff in my own domicile and with my friends and neighbors in my community. So I live in Santa Monica, and Santa Monica is not really as progressive as some people might think. So there's huge infighting going on in this community now, as one example, and I'm sure that's similarly, you know, around the country now. Partly because we're in a time of such dramatic change, and people are highly stressed for a lot of reasons. So in answer to your question, Shelley, my thought is I start in my home and I start with my friends. And what we're trying to do, some of my friends, is we're trying to buy up some old apartment buildings and basically convert them into community land trusts and limited equity housing co-ops, and basically try to demonstrate these ideas and experiment with them. We do have a food co-op in town, but the food co-op has been taken over by the Erewhon and Whole Earth types, you know, the gentrifiers. So, you know, you go there and you've got, like, you know, 75 different kinds of organic purple corn chips. You know what I mean? You know the type, right? So we're in a time of great, great challenge and transition. But my thought in answer to your question is I start with myself. I start with my friends, and we're just trying to demonstrate this. And the theory of change is actually, there's a theory of change, which is you just do it. You don't ask for permission, you just do it. And you model it, and then other people will see it, and they will then themselves begin to adopt some of those ideas themselves. In field theory, I think it's called an attractor. ATTRACTOR. So you just set up an example and you just start doing it, and then people see it and then they come to it and they themselves. So I'm not trying to change anybody's mind. I have chaired the neighborhood council in this entire community of 93,000 at one point, 2.5 years. I used to be a teacher. I don't want to try to change anyone's mind anymore. I just want to do the work and demonstrate it as best I can, and also demonstrate the value and the benefits, which is one of the virtues, if you will, of the Blue Marble evaluation methodology. It's very robust and very, I would say, compelling. Does that answer your question? Did that help?
Yeah, I would like to have a longer conversation with you. I won't do it now, but I mean, this is amazing stuff that you're talking about.
So a comment, I don't think you can operate on the small scale level unless you have at least a theory about the large scale level. You're working within a context probably that says that global warming would be a bad thing and overpopulation is probably a big problem, and too much nationalism and warfare and so forth, a big problem. Those are all world issues. And so unless we understand the world, you're just as likely to make a mistake at the local level as you are to do something that's actually helpful. You've got to have a bigger context. And I would suggest that the only real context is not the United States, not Fayetteville, not my farm or my house, but rather the globe. That's the only real context to put all the small scale decisions within. And so you got two very important systems at the opposite end of the poles. One is basically yourself, and the other is the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
You got to make those jive somehow. I think it's just as important maybe more, to consider the globe as to consider, say, Fayetteville or yourself. We need the big context. That's what's missing around the world.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Really good comments. Thank you. Anything else?
Well, in relation to that, Arlene, in the big context and global thinking, you mentioned the United Nations only once in all of this, and it was very quick in passing. It was their goals. I've forgotten what it's called.
Sustainable Development Goals,
Sustainable
SDGs.
Development Goals.
Yeah.
Those are now that period of United Nations is passed. I mean, those goals were completed, I believe.
Oh, no, it's a work in progress. People are working with those now, but this is a very dynamic period in human history. So, 2 years from now, maybe they will have morphed into something hopefully a little bit better.
Well, my question actually was in relation to Art, what Art said. Then the United Nations would be something we would want to focus on as a holistic and connective and comprehensive and global.
Well, certainly,
Absolutely.
yeah, to the extent that we can all cooperate for mutual benefit globally and maintain those dialogues and those conversations with an empirical basis, yeah.
The United Nations is the only big operation in the world that's dedicated to the welfare of the world rather than just some particular nation. And why we can't devote much more of our budget and our attention or efforts in the United States, a country that considers itself the world leader in some sense, why we can't devote much more attention to the United Nations rather than to our own national interests is beyond me. The United Nations, where the focus really ought to be all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That is more where we owe our allegiance to the world rather than to the country or to Fayetteville, except at the other end of the spectrum again, except perhaps for the family and your close relatives, something like that, the clan, whatever that means.
Agreed, yes. Okay, anyone else want to add any thoughts or what do you think, Jack? What do you think, Edward? Did we lose Quinn? Is Quinn still here? You're off my screen, Quinn. I can't see.
This is Jack. This is Jack. I'm deciding that I must be pretty good at this because my notes are just full of fuzzy thinking, and a couple of things that kind of, I am immediately attracted to anything that mentions things like blue marble evaluation and design thinking, and those vocabulary words pull me in immedially. But in order to have a paradigm shift, we need a different vocabulary, I think, in order to reach a broader audience. And I'm thinking in particular, for example, the need for an understanding of uncertainty. And that's one of the flaws in the way our science education goes, is that we present facts to people and we don't emphasize that it's all uncertain. It's the state of the art at that moment, and it's subject to change. I think that's one of our impediments.
Yeah. And yeah, that's one of the critiques of science. And yeah, so we need science. And Jane Jacobs spoke about that too. But yeah, that decision making under deep uncertainty, that is really good stuff. And I think you're going to enjoy that because those folks are smart and they're trying to figure out how to get their heads around this. And they're having a conference coming up and it's not too expensive. I think it's like $100 or something. See this? Jack, does this appeal to you? Look at this stuff.
It does, yes.
It's so much fun. Look at
My concern is not so much with science as with the way it's understood by the general public.
Yeah.
Agreed. So yeah, what are we going to do about that?
Science literacy would be my suggestion. Teach
Yeah.
more science to people and teach them what scientists know quite well, that science is always uncertain.
Mhm.
If you want certainty, turn to religion, but because they're always certain of whatever their particular beliefs happen to be.
Mhm.
But scientists know that even conservation of energy, the most secure law of all probably in science, is not certain. And in fact, they seriously doubted it for about 30 years toward the beginning, from about 1920 to about 1950. They seriously doubted it until they discovered the neutrino, which saved the day for conservation of energy. But scientists always doubt their conclusions, and people don't understand that. You're never going to have certainty in any system of correct thinking because you can never be certain of anything.
That's right.
Scientists merely try to quantify that uncertainty to some extent, and that's very useful. You're talking here about systemic thinking, and probably the biggest flaw in our systemic thinking throughout society is the inability to cope with uncertainty and probabilities, situations that really amount to chance.
Yeah.
Not everything happens for a reason. Some things just happen because that's the breaks.
People tend to feel uneasy or fearful with uncertainty sometimes.
And we invent all sorts of weird systems to explain some of the uncertain outcomes when they're just coincidences, actually. Coincidences happen.
Well, Art, you're going to
roll a
love
12 with dice or a
Yes.
2.
Yeah, God doesn't play dice. Well, you're going to love this one. You see, have you heard of quantum biology?
Yeah.
And photosynthesis, they now think is a quantum phenomena. So I was at a conference, and I'm going to show you that in just a moment, at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which was founded by Edgar Mitchell, because he had an epiphany when he was out in space. And so I'm at this conference at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and there were about 150 people there. And about 50 of them were hardcore physicists and biologists, you know, like people from Stanford and Berkeley and MIT. And then about 50 of them were like clairvoyants and psychics. And then about 50 of them were like people like me. I'm just curious. So, so I'm at this conference. And then all of a sudden, these scientists all started arguing with each other about quantum biology. Because apparently it's quite relevant to some of these questions. And so these very highly esteemed, scholarly, you know, 60-year-old scientists were all saying things to each other like, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, the role of quantum physics in biology is a very big and controversial issue for biologists and physicists.
So again, you know, the interesting stuff is happening at these interstitial interdisciplinary spaces. And I just think it's really important to keep our minds open and keep our eyes peeled and see what comes up on the horizon. Now, speaking of the horizon, the final section here before we go to our cases is the so-called Institute of Noetic Sciences. So who here knows what noetic means? Oh, come on, Art, don't fail me now.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Okay. Okay, noetic means it's basically noetics is a branch of metaphysics concerned with the study of the mind. And in ancient Greek and medieval philosophy, it included the doctrine of the way the mind works and so on. So there is something called the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And we're going to go there right now through the wonders of the internet. So this is the institute started by Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut. And here. And so they are a bunch of hardcore nerdy scientists trying to figure out how the mind interacts with nature and how minds interact with other minds. And so really interesting stuff. And so I've been there to 2 different conferences. And this thing about energy medicine in the heart, amazing research. So I invite you to zoom around this website and take a look at the community group network, their various conferences. I think I went to both of those conferences. They have a retreat, they have a blog, they have something also called the Chi Network. You can participate in some of their research. And then they have different resources and media that they make available. And these are nerdy people, so I think that I feel very comfortable with, you know, intense, hardcore nerds. And so one of the main guys there is Dean Radin, and Dean Radin has written a couple of books, one of which is called Supernormal, and the other one's called I forgot, something about the mind. Supernormal. So what he did was he looked at ancient wisdom traditions. I think this one was on the East, including yoga. And then he compared it with what the research shows. So that he's trying to figure out what are the wisdom traditions? How do the wisdom traditions map to the current research? And then he had another one called Supermind or something like that, where he's looking at the Western wisdom traditions and how they map to the research. And so this is kind of pretty interesting. So this is all sponsored by the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And the basic idea here is that our minds are all interacting right now, and our minds interact also with nature, and that we have some kind of a relationship. And so part of our work by this way of thinking means that we need to make sure that our minds are aligned, I would say, with the vision. Okay, so questions, comments before we go on to getting real here.
I am so excited you brought this up because just before you said this, I was thinking, well, I was telling Mike last night, you know, we were looking at the moon and I was remembering this little boy who had been raised by wolves or something and could never learn language, but he would look at the moon for hours. And I was thinking about how language has interfered with direct experience. And
was that the little French boy about 200 years ago?
Yeah, something like that. It was a long time ago. Now, he was never able to learn language, but what it was what has language done to our ability to be in direct experience? And so we have to, that direct experience is absolutely essential for complete participation in oneness with the earth. At the same time, we're dealing with people with the short-term thinking who are thinking totally about manipulation for self-interest. So you have, how do you, like, if you're living in this one place with like something like fuzzy thinking somewhere in between this complete participation in direct experience up to, you know, then there's the flexible thinking, the fuzzy thinking, and the people who are totally manipulative. How do we manage dealing with this?
Well, I worry about that stuff, and I think about that stuff all the time. I think part of it is strengthening I think it's partly about developing one's intuition. So I'm focusing on trying to be mindful, develop my intuition, and also to protect myself from that stuff that just feels so harmful. And I would characterize some of that as toxic.
Toxic, that's the word.
Yeah, and I've come to think of myself kind of, I think this is sort of mystical in a way. But yeah, direct experience sometimes it works with intuition. And intuition, there are people who study this, and it's a real thing. It's a real thing.
Sure. Intuition
Okay.
protects you from lions and tigers.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Anything
evolution.
more? Go ahead.
Intuition protects you from being killed by lions and tigers, because as soon as you see one or hear it growling at you, your genes teach you directly to get out of the way, to escape, climb a tree, whatever it is, protect yourself. So it's immediate intuition.
Anything more? What do you think, Alberto? You've been so quiet. You're not getting off the hook without saying something. And Edward, you're
Thanks,
next.
Arlene. Hey, it's overwhelming amount of information to me. One thing that I've been thinking though is how do we get the bulk of the population on board with the philosophical leap so that we all pull towards the same side. Otherwise, I think we had a conversation before some months ago where a number of consensus was mentioned. It was somewhere around 80% estimated as required for a society to move in one direction. Otherwise, the world is now about 50-50, right? Half is pulling for one side, the other half is pulling to the opposite side, and that is not leading us anywhere beneficial, at least. And so this information is really neat. My question is, or my thinking has been all these moments about how to bring these with that philosophical leap for people to really come together and start moving in that direction where humanity needs to for the sake of our planet.
Alberto, I'm going to try to answer in a brief way because it's a huge subject. But the Guardian newspaper out of Manchester, England, I think just had a book review of a book written by some academics where they found that media now intentionally divides the populace. And so the way that the powers that would be, including the Murdochs, what they do is they slice and dice the population into smaller and smaller subsegments, thereby then creating differences and not finding ways that we unite around common needs and common goals and empathy. So they've divided everybody into all these subsegments and everybody's mad at each other. And so I don't think I have the power as an individual to change that. And I don't think it's going to happen for quite some time. So the theory of change that I'm working with is not, it's about starting with myself and with my colleagues, my network, and we are going to we do model this ourselves to be agents of transformation by modeling these transformative ways. Now, there was a program about a week ago put on by Project Censored, which is out of California State University, north of the Bay Area. I forgot the name of it. And they had this great critical media literacy conference. Here it was. And essentially, they deconstructed the media now and showed how the media is intentionally dividing people against each other. And so, Alberto, this is more than any of us can do. So I just want to be aware that this is apparently what's going on now. And, you know, look to alternative media if that's what you want to do. Try to be mindful. But my thought is, I just want to start doing the work. And partly to demonstrate it, partly from a point of view of self-preservation, because things are going to fall apart. I've been on a lot of different working groups where there's quite a lot of fear that within 5 years or some timeline like that, we could suffer food shortages because there will be droughts, there will be heat events. In the Midwest, probably it's going to have major heat events. The Central Valley in California, the soils are all contaminated with heavy metals, including selenium from the use of artificial fertilizers. And so there's going to be major issues with food, with heat. There will be major civil insurrection. David Attenborough just issued about an hour and something long program, which he calls his testament. And he laments the loss of biodiversity. And then in the last 20 minutes or so in that David Attenborough program, he says, if I understood him correctly, that we need to be prepared for population crashes. The population now is at something like 7.8 billion. The carrying capacity by some calculations is somewhere around 2 billion. Alberto, there are going to be major crashes. So you're there in Fayetteville, and you guys are probably in a pretty good spot. You got water, you're protected from major urban centers. So just do your best to demonstrate these, you know, the solutions. But I gave up. I don't want to try to convince anyone.
Arlene, I'm going to be political here, but I don't feel as safe as you are saying for us here living in Fayetteville, because we are surrounded by Republicans.
Oh, really? Well, they're not. I bet they're not wearing masks, right?
I'd like to hear from Molly.
Very good.
Arlene, I was going to make a comment about one of your responses to Alberto was that you're going to start with yourself and your community. I bet you all are familiar with the 100th monkey theory, or an idea whose time has come. And there's been some more data on it. But I don't remember the percentages. It was either 3.5% or 6% of a population. Once that percentage of a population believes, as you and I would say, a positive thought, like Alberto was wondering, how are we going to change the bulk of the population to have the philosophy we do of cherishing the earth and each other? Well, once a certain percentage does that, then it goes throughout the population. I don't really remember the speed of it, but I really love the thought of those monkeys washing the sweet potatoes in the clear water, and then somehow the next island over and the next island over, it was probably Indonesia. I just harvested my sweet potatoes, so it had a particular effect on me to mention it.
Here it is right here.
Yeah, I see that. Yep.
Yeah, and there's videos on it too. Here we go.
Yeah. I'm glad
And,
you're so facile and agile with your computer like that. It's wonderful to see you bring up all these things. See the sweet potatoes?
yeah. And this is Tom Hartman. Hang on. Anyway, the thing is that the monkeys remotely started washing their yams, even though they had never seen anybody doing it on a different
Right.
island. Yeah,
Right.
100 monkey. Okay.
Could I bring in?
All right, go for it.
Okay. To come back to Alberto's question, what can we do about it? I would suggest we need to look again at the global level and in institutions like the United Nations,
Yes.
and we need to put our major effort into education for the world, not just for the United States or any particular country. And in particular, say the Middle Eastern countries,
Oh, gosh. And their treatment of women.
African countries that are struggling. The struggling countries especially need a lot of help with education. And it should be of a general nature. Don't try to inculcate them with American philosophies or anything nationalistic like that.
Mhm.
Just basic things about science and about history, for instance. Those two areas, I would say, should be emphasized to the exclusion of politics and more controversial things, to make it really universal. And that just needs to happen all over the world. Education takes a while, but it's the only way to get the human race to the place where it needs to be.
Mhm. Well, you're right. The UN does have such programs.
They need to be greatly expanded, hugely.
Mhm.
Take our money that we spend on our military and many other more or less superfluous items and put that into international education through the UN.
Okay.
Even if, Art, even if it is only a fraction of that military budget, it would bring a huge effect on education, as you're saying, globally,
Yes.
not only in this country. I totally agree.
And somebody mentioned overpopulation, that idea of the 9 billion, 10 billion we're approaching versus the 2 billion that we'd ought to get down to. That shouldn't be controversial, really, and that needs to get out there, along with things like birth control and teaching some things about fundamental health like that.
Mhm. Agreed.
Is
Well,
my
there are
micro-
some. Go ahead. Oh, and Edward, you were next. We need to hear from you, please.
So I always dig myself a hole because I listen to these discussions, you know, and I appreciate the resources that you present to us. And I've read many of those people, and I respect all the scientists. But in the end, I always come down to the fact that part of our problem is that the scientific community fails to communicate at a level that can reach most people when they're communicating the science of the problem. And some of the people like E.M. Schumacher or Wendell Berry have a much more down-to-earth method of communicating, which we need to reach the people to make the change we need. And I don't know how else to characterize that, but by over intellectualizing and over, you know, I mean, I respect the work scientists do, and their conclusions are usually right, but they're not necessarily in a position to communicate with the masses in a way that we need.
Yeah, you know, narratives. I'm hearing a lot about narratives. People are working on developing different narratives.
I very much agree with you, Edward. And so part of the teaching that needs to be done is scientists need to be taught to communicate. And that's where scientific literacy comes in. Teaching scientific literacy requires that scientists be able to communicate their science.
Yeah.
It's important stuff.
Well, I would just like to say something about that. I mean, scientists, we're absolutely, those who can communicate in a narrative fashion are absolutely dependent on the research that the scientists do every day that may take them years and years and years to come across one single result. So you can't expect one type of personality to do everything, right? So you have someone spending years and years determining that, like I'm reading this book, Overstory, that trees communicate with each other, which took years and years and years. But someone else can tell the story about it. So what we need is this understanding of being able to work together to share our various gifts in that way so that we can get the information out.
There
Yeah.
is a community of scientists these days that are devoted specifically to communicating science. In other words, scientists who are primarily interested in science education rather than science itself, but who understand real science. Have participated in real science research, but see the main problem as the problem of science literacy and teaching the rest of the world about science. And not that science is the only thing people need to learn about, but yeah, scientists are horrible communicators usually because they're in they're ivory tower type people, and they communicate to each other with mathematics and things that other people don't get. You got to speak to people in their own language, and it's a major problem.
Dick, do you want to add anything more here?
If we're approaching the end, I would be grateful if you would select one or two of the movements, of the one or two individuals, one or two books that I might then pursue. I won't be able to follow up with so much that you've said, but I will try to go keep studying what you've suggested today. If you could do that, if there is time left, I would be grateful for that. Or you could maybe write us a letter afterward if we've run out of time, Lolly.
Well, let me ask the consensus of the group. Edward, Art, Jack, Shelley, Alberto, Lolly, Gladys, what do you think we should recommend that Dick start with? What one resource?
Arlene, I went through as you spoke and circled ones I want to go back to. So there's several, and I'll just list mine quickly, then somebody else can take over and list theirs as well.
Okay.
The Daniel Wall Designing Regenerative Culture, I was interested in. And then the websites on nature-based solutions, I was interested in to go back to.
Okay.
The blue marble evaluation, I wanted to go back to. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Always the Schumacher, I like them a lot. And there was one from the UN, and I don't know. And I wanted to go back to DMDU, whatever that was, and then quantum biology.
Decision making under deep uncertainty.
Yeah, those are the ones I wanted to go back to. I know that's a long list too, but those are things I was interested in. Thank you.
The Eleanor Ostrom book, I think, would be interesting to Dick. Was that called The Tragedy of the Commons? And you're saying it's the tragedy of the markets, but what is the book that's related to that?
Well, let me show you. She's written a number of books. So let me go to her Wikipedia page, which lists all of her books. The Tragedy of the Commons actually was written by Garrett Ekbo, but that's not true. Actually, it's been converted to The Tragedy of the Markets by David Wallier. So the idea, so this is her Wikipedia page, and she wrote a number of fabulous books. I've got most of them here. I like this one, Governing the Commons. This is a good one. This is good.
Because Dick is especially interested in capitalism and in militarism. And
okay. Well, I think this was actually critical.
Plenty of those books to read. We have a guest from another state who has these special interests, and so I'm interested in following up maybe one or two books that you think are especially important to what you believe in, and I'll do my best to follow them.
Thank you, Dick.
I have plenty of reading to do, things I'm interested in myself.
What's your background? What did you do professionally? What did you study in school?
I'm an English professor.
Okay.
I've been wanting to say the use of the word fuzzy is most unfortunate, because thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of English teachers who teach English 101, Introduction to Writing. We use the word fuzzy all the time to mean imprecise. What did you mean? And we write that because we can't explain on hundreds of papers a week, so we say fuzzy. Fuzzy is the most negative of terms in the English world. And now
that's your bias. That's your bias.
That's a very practical usage. No, it's not a bias. It's, if you look up the dictionary, you'll find out what fuzzy means. It means
I know what fuzzy means. And I do it.
And so there's a revolution going on, changing the definitions, and I stand up against that.
Okay, Dick, here's your assignment. Are you ready? Are you ready?
Just a minute.
Okay, you got to write it down. It's your homework.
Got it.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
Think like a commoner by David Bollier. This one, Think Like a Commoner. And then if you want backup, then
Wally
Patterns of
recommend
Comedy.
that book.
Think Like a Commoner.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Now,
Okay.
let's give other people a chance to speak. You asked
Okay.
me.
Okay. Well, let's. Anyone else want to speak before we go to the cases? Because we have we have about 10 more minutes. So we're going to page 4 for those of you who have a copy of this thing. So now we're going to apply it all, because remember, we're going to actually do it. We are doers. We are informed doers seeking an empirical basis with principle-based, agile, and adaptive. So I am going to give you one example, and then be ready, because I'm going to ask you guys to each give your own example. So I want to give you the example of the Los Angeles Eco Village. So here we go. Say what? Okay, so the Los Angeles Eco Village. Okay, this is phenomenal. This is on the east side of what's called Koreatown, which is maybe 5 miles west of downtown LA. And it was kind of a funky neighborhood. And this woman, this amazing woman here, Lois Arkin, can you see her? She is now 84 years old. And notice how she's surrounded by all these young people. So she figured out how to buy basically 4 big apartment buildings in Koreatown, plus a commercial property, using peer financing, no banks. And she created an urban living demonstration project. The land is in a community land trust. All of these beautiful buildings are in limited equity co-ops. And to live there, you have to go through a vetting process. And then once you've lived there for 5 years, then you graduate into an equity position, and you are one of the owners of the co-op. And they have a really beautiful process of helping people understand this cooperative governance structure. They have bicycle repair shops. They have an amazing wood shop and tool shop, and they've got only 2 rules. You want to know the 2 rules for their shop? I'm going to tell you. When you finish working there, it must be at least as neat and tidy as when you started working there. And the second rule is no blood. So they have a great sense of humor, very pro-social, and they have a lot of programs. So, and Lois is tied in with every progressive movement you can think of. And she's part of the Co-Housing Association. She's on the Global Eco Village Network. They have programs all the time, like at least once a week. Even though right now we have COVID, they do a lot of stuff online. So this is the Limited Equity Housing Co-op. They call it US2, Urban Soil Tierra Urbana. This is their community land trust. They are involved with food lobbies to basically grow food in the urban environment and food exchanges. This is her educational nonprofit, the LA Eco Village Institute, where, so if somebody, for example, she's working with a big architecture firm, so they donate architectural services to this nonprofit, and so they get IRS brownie points, and she gets free architectural design services. So people love her. She's like, received all sorts of awards from the city of LA for her amazing work. They have a time bank, so people donate labor to the time bank, and then they get something from somebody else. They have members that they profile. They have lots of resources, and it's very dynamic. Now she's 84, and I'm actually on this board. So I'm on the board of the land trust. And so I'm experiencing the intergenerational. This is one of their buildings. They also took over the street. So the street has got all sorts of paintings in it and crosswalks and stuff. They did this with a guy out of Portland called Earth Repair, Mark Lakeman out of Portland. So she's really kind of the point person for a lot of really interesting cutting edge activism. And but what I'm experiencing, and I understand that there are some of the older people there that are a little bit sad too. The 20-year-olds are coming in and going, but you guys are so old and fuddy-duddy, you know? Well, I've known Lois for 40 years. She built this thing up with a few of her friends. And now the youngins are feeling like, well, you know, she's so old. So there's also the intergenerational transfer issue and how to take this wonderful way of thinking and working that she essentially invented for Los Angeles. She's like the prime example. And how to bring in the next generation so that they recognize the hard work and the heartfelt effort that went into building this, and that they honor that legacy, but are also informed and become skilled at how to carry it on. So that's another issue here. So that's the case study I wanted to tell you about. It would receive you know, lots of high grades using the blue marble evaluation methodology. So who else wants to give an example?
I want to speak up for Gladys since she can't, but between Gladys and Dick and Omni, I feel like that's one of our examples of something like the Eco Village that's in LA. Because between all the people who've been working at Omni, Shelley and Alberto, all of these other folks, they've created so many different spaces, kind of like what you're talking about. Gladys says she doesn't have sound, so she can't say this, and I don't know all the things that Omni Center for Justice, Peace, and Ecology has done, because I don't live there, but I know that it's tremendous. So, and for myself, ours is very individualistic. It's our farm. And so through our farm, we're connecting with the people on the mountain, and we do things together. And when the tornado came through, you know, everybody came to help us clean up after the tornado. And now we're starting a small women's group. And because I'm so interested in indigenous philosophy, I bring that into the women's group. And all of that is part of my own self-understanding of climate change and of how we should be treating each other in the world. So good. Thanks for going to Omni. That's all I have. Thank you.
Beautiful. And thank you, Gladys. Beautiful.
Lolly, what is the name of your farm?
Let's see. Norm put a name to it. Oh, but no, it's to his business. We don't really have a name.
Doesn't matter. It sounded like you might have a name.
I need to thank you, Dick. I'll try to think of a name.
We'll work on that.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Eileen, I don't want to talk about right now what we're doing. It would take a while. I'm interested. Are you already connected with Transitions and with David Cobb and with Cooperation Humboldt? You already know those people?
Well, I went to the transition, the one Rob Hopkins.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went to their conference, and I was in one of their working groups. But yeah, it's good. It's really good. Yeah.
Cooperation Humboldt is in your area, and David described when they had to respond to the fires and the people who were refugees there, how they started working with in a very flexible, cooperative way with two, I believe one was the Salvation Army and the other one was the Red Cross. And each one of them had a really distinct role to play, and they worked together so beautifully, where the Transitions group, the Cooperation Humboldt, they were doing all the transportation of all the food. I believe the Red Cross was providing the food. The Salvation Army was cooking the food, something like that. And they pulled together like, I don't know, 100 people in just a flash, because they already had this cooperation planned ahead of time. It was so beautifully adaptive. And that was, I believe that was in your area.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good examples. Thank you. Who else would like to give an example?
Well, I'll try one out. It's more of a movement than a small group in any particular locale. It's always been one of my favorite ideas for organizing cities, which are more and more the focus of where most people are living. And it's called the New Urbanism, but it's not that new anymore. It goes back 30 years. And one of its Bibles, I don't know if you see this, but the geography is backwards, isn't it? So it's called The Geography of Nowhere by James Kunstler, written in the 1990s. Very nice book about the ideas, basic ideas of the new urbanism. And its basic ideas are that we need to get away from automobiles. We need to get away from the suburbs. You need to let cities be cities that are connected by urban types of transportation, which primarily means walking, and secondarily means mass transit, and third means bicycles, and fourth, or maybe further down the list, if there's further, would be the automobile. We way overemphasize that the automobile is behind a lot of the destruction in America today, in advanced and in other advanced countries, especially America, because we are so attached to our automobiles. So it's a whole culture here that needs to be changed, and a whole way of life really associated with the suburbs, commuting into work, all of that. And I think it could change quite a bit if we adopt a lot more of their principles. And I'm happy to say that Fayetteville, Arkansas has adopted a lot of these principles, such as infill and not continuing to build the suburbs. But unfortunately, we have very powerful real estate dealers, and they continue to build the suburbs. But that's not the way to go, and I'd like to see it changed.
Well, that Selk group, this group is basically part of the anti-real estate movement, radical real estate. So I'm a registered architect, but I also have a real estate license. So the idea, and this is part of what the Community Land Trust and the Limited Equity Housing Co-op is about, is essentially keeping the wealth within the community so that the people in the community own the real estate. And that would mean housing. It would also mean commercial. So for example, where I live, we've been hugely gentrified. And so one of the sayings that has come up is better neighborhoods, same neighbors. So even though we have rent control in this area, it's so hard. What they do is they just tear down the building and force the people to move. So this whole movement, and it's statewide in California, and in LA County, there are 330 organizations in a coalition that I'm a member of that is essentially pushing for community land trusts and co-op housing and co-op commercial properties. So I hope that's informative. And so these folks have got a lot of great resources. Again, this woman, Janelle Orsi, wrote this book on co-ops and sharing economy.
Yeah. Good ideas.
Okay, did we lose Quinn? Did I offend her with my comment about cathedrals?
No.
I think she just had to leave. Alberto has just left too.
Oh, really? Oh, we lost
And Charles
Alberto.
left a little while back. I think folks,
We usually start
Arlene,
leaving.
don't you have a program you have to go to? Don't you have a doctor's appointment soon?
Yeah, I'm supposed to get an acupuncture treatment. I got 3 more minutes and then I got to leave. Anybody want to say anything more?
Thank you. Alberto
Kelly.
sent you thanks in the chat.
Kelly
Can you-
wants to say something.
Thank you.
This has been amazing, Arlene. I want to stay in touch with you. I want to connect you with some people I know in that area. It's just wonderful. Your sharing of your knowledge was brilliant. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay, happy day, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to chat with you. I hope this is informative and helpful.
Thanks, Arlene.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you,
Bye,
Shelley. Bye, Edward. Bye, Art. Bye,
Bye-bye.
Shelley. Bye, Dick. Bye, Lolly. Bye, Gladys.
Thank you, Gladys. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
great. Bye.